This is chapter 25, part A. It's the beginning of looking at the urinary system. We're going to look at briefly at the anatomy and then also get into the physiology of the urinary system, which is involved with filtering the blood and eliminating toxins and waste in that production of urine, that it will rid the body of those. The kidneys are the major organ of the urinary system. They have a lot of different functions. They help to regulate the volume of water and the concentration of solutes that's present in the blood. This is also going to play a role with the acid-base balance of the blood. It's going to be excreting waste, including toxins, drugs, anything that's been in the blood. Another function of the kidney is that it helps to produce erythropoietin, which is involved with blood pressure, and renin, which helps to regulate red blood cell production. It helps to activate vitamin D, and if needed, it can carry out gluconeogenesis. Other components of the urinary system are the ureters, which are going to transport that urine that has been formed in the kidneys, and it transports it to the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder is essentially a storage facility for the urine until it can be transported out of the body via the urethra. In this diagram, you can see the two kidneys. Notice they're not exactly even. One's a little bit higher than the other. On top of the kidneys, you do have the adrenal gland. And then from the kidneys, you have the ureters that extend down to the urinary bladder. In females, the urinary bladder is just below the uterus. And then the urethra, as I said, drains the bladder. With the kidneys, there's three different layers outside the kidney that help to support it. There's the renal fascia, which helps to anchor the kidney in place. The pararenal fat capsule also helps to position it correctly and helps to cushion it. And then the fibrous capsule. The fibrous capsule is directly surrounding the kidney itself and would prevent infection from spreading to the kidney. And in this cross-section, you can see the location of these supportive tissue layers. Once again, you've got the renal fascia, the pararenal fat capsule, and then the fibrous capsule. There are certain conditions, such as renal ptosis, which is where at least one of the kidneys, it could be both, drops to a lower position. If this happens, a side effect from it could be that the ureter, instead of being stretched out, it becomes kinked. And if it becomes kinked, think of like your garden hose. If it gets kinked and then the water can't flow through, well, the same thing would happen with you, is that the urine cannot flow through. It backs up and puts extra pressure on the kidneys. If you have this backup of urine then up into the kidneys, it can cause kidney damage, and if left untreated, it could lead ultimately to renal failure. If we look at the kidney, the internal portion of it can be divided into three different regions. You have the renal cortex, which is the most superficial. Remember, whenever you see cortex, it's superficial, and then medulla is going to be more interior. So you have the renal cortex, then you have the renal medulla. The renal medulla is divided into different little sections. They look like little pyramids, kind of triangular shaped, with the tips, which we call the papilla, that points internally. Between each of the pyramids are what we call the renal columns. This is actually extension of the cortical tissue. And the third section is the renal pelvis. This is right before the ureter. It almost looks like the shape of a funnel. It includes the minor calyces, the major calyces. So when the urine is being produced, it's going to go from the renal pyramid, flow to the minor calyx, from there to the major calyx, from there to the renal pelvis, and then finally out the ureter. So in the cross-section of the kidney here, you can see once again the renal cortex being that outermost superficial layer, and then the renal medulla. As I said, you can see the pyramids, the papillas, the tip of the pyramid that points to the minor calyx, the larger area. Then for several of the minor calyxes flow into that larger area called the major calyx, and the major calyx is going to flow into the renal pelvis, which then flows to the ureter. Inflammation of the renal pelvis and those calyces areas is known as pyelitis, and pyelonephritis is inflammation of the entire kidney. If left untreated, it could result once again in kidney damage. So it can be, most kidney infections can be treated fairly successfully with antibiotics. Because the kidneys are helping to filter out the blood and remove drugs and toxins and waste products from the blood, it needs to have a very high blood supply. When we look at the way the blood flow comes in to the kidneys, first blood is coming or arriving through the renal arteries. From there, it is going to go to the segmental artery, to the interlobal arteries, which are going to be flowing basically the columns between those pyramids, and then the arcuate arteries, and finally the cortical radiate arteries. From there, it's going to flow into what we call the glomerulus, which we'll talk about in a moment, and finally at the end it goes from the veins to the cortical vein, to the arcuate vein, interlobal vein, and finally it leaves the kidney via the renal veins. In terms of nerve supply, the kidney is innervated by the renal plexus, which contains sympathetic nerve fibers. And this cross-section shows visually all of the various arteries and veins. Notice how the blood's going to come in through the renal artery and then slowly start branching. And as I said, it's going to be the interlobal arteries that flow up through the columns, and then it's going to wrap around the pyramids. And this is just a different way of showing the blood flow through the kidney. What is in the box is in what we call the glomeralis, which we're going to talk about shortly. The nephrons, these are the structural and the functional unit of the kidney that's going to actually be forming the urine. There's over 1 million of these per kidney. There's two main parts to it, the renal corpuscle and the renal tubule. With the renal corpuscle, that itself has two components. The glomerulus, which I mentioned just a bit ago, it has this surrounding of capillaries. In these capillaries, the epithelium are fenestrated, which means they have pores in them. This is where you're going to have a lot of filtration occurring. And then the second part is the glomerular capsule. It's also known as the Bowman's capsule. It is surrounding that glomerulus. If you were to look at it, it looks like a hollow cup around this glomerulus. It is also composed of a couple of different layers that are going to be assisting with the filtration process. So in this cross-section, if you look at a nephron, the nephron is considered where you have, as you can see, the renal corpuscle, which has, it looks like a round ball. It has the capsule, which is kind of like a cup that's surrounding this mass of capillaries. That's the glomerulus. And then there's a network of tubes, as you can see. So we're going to walk through each component of this. The renal tubule portion consists of epithelial cells. There's three main parts of this. It's going to contain first the proximal convoluted tubule, then the nephron loop, also known as the loop of Henle, and then the distal convoluted tubule. That distal convoluted tubule is going to drain into ultimately the collecting duct. And by this point, what is draining into the collecting duct is the urine. The proximal convoluted tubule is going to be involved with reabsorption and secretion. So it's going to be moving substances from newly formed urine back into the blood, but also removing additional components out of the blood and into the urine. The nephron loop, like I said, also known as the loop of Henle, it's a U-shaped with what's known as a descending limb as well as an ascending limb. And then the distal convoluted tubule, you're going to have more secretion occurring here, putting substances back into the blood. And then those collecting ducts, at this point, this is receiving the urine from the nephron. And you're going to have cells here that are going to be involved somewhat with the water and sodium balance, which also is involved with the acid-base balance. The collecting ducts are receiving this filtrate, this formed urine, not just from one nephron, but several different nephrons. So we typically will show in the diagrams just one nephron attached, but you can see the attachment points where all up and down the collecting duct you have several nephrons attached to it. So you've got this input of the filtrate, which is the urine, and then the collecting ducts are all fused together, and they will deposit the urine into the minor calyces. So once again, here you can see on the diagram that there's only one nephron, but all those connection points along the collecting duct, each one of those would be connected to another nephron. Because remember, I said you have over 1 million of these per kidney. There's two different types or classes of nephrons. You have the cortical nephrons. This is the most common one, and these are, in terms of their location, are mostly in the cortex. You also have larger ones or longer juxtamedullary nephrons. They have a very long loop of Henle that does go down into the medulla, into the pyramid portion of the medulla. So you can see here the difference in the size of them, but most of the smaller cortical nephrons, as you can see, their loop of Henle is much shorter, so most of it is located within the cortex region. At the nephron capillary beds, we do have two different capillary beds. The one that surrounds the glomerulus for the initial filtration process, and then you also have capillaries that are known as the peritibial capillaries that are surrounding, certainly around the loop of Henle and around the proximal and distal convoluted tubules. The juxtamedullary nephrons are also associated with the third one that's known as the bassa recta. So with the glomerulus, the capillaries are a bed around this, is specialized for this filtration. You have an afferent arteriole that is going to enter the glomerulus, and then the blood is going to leave via what we call the efferent arteriole. So it's both arterioles, it's not a venule. Blood pressure tends to be very high in the glomerulus. Now if you stop and think about this, if you remember, when we were talking about the respiratory system, that pressure is similar to liquid in terms of, say, diffusion. Everything wants to move from high concentration to low concentration. Well, substances want to go from high pressure to low pressure. And so if the blood pressure is very high in the glomerulus, this is going to assist with the filtration. Substances moving out of the blood and into the glomerulus. The peritibial capillaries, here the blood pressure is low because they are surrounding the tubules where you are often having secretion occurring, which means you are putting substances back into the blood. The vasa recta, this is just associated with the nephron loops of the juxtamedullary nephrons, and it's going to be involved with helping to form concentrated urine. And this is a picture showing the round spherical structures. Those are the glomerulus. You have the afferent arteriole coming in, the efferent arteriole leaving it, and then you also have those peritibial capillary beds that you can see in addition. And once again, just another schematic diagram showing this. Now, each nephron has one JGC, or juxtaglomerular complex, and this is just helping with regulating the rate at which the filtrate is going to be formed and regulating blood pressure. So there's different cells that are involved with this. Your macula densa or chemoreceptors, they're helping to sense the sodium chloride concentration in that filtrate. You also have granular cells. They are helping, or they contain granules that secrete the enzyme renin. They act as mechanoreceptors. They are sensing the blood pressure. And then you have your extraglomerular mesangial cells that help with intercommunication, essentially. So all these are going to be working together to help monitor the blood pressure within the glomerulus. In terms of how much fluid is passing through the kidneys, on average, about 180 liters of fluid. Now, if you have problems visualizing the metric system especially, think of it this way. Most of you are familiar with, say, a 2-liter bottle of soda. We're talking 90 of these per day. So the kidneys are pretty busy with filtering the amount of plasma that's running through. What's going to happen as the blood comes through is that it's going to form this filtrate, which ultimately is going to be the urine. You are basically filtering most of the substances out of the blood other than the proteins and the red blood cells. So you're going to be producing the urine, which is essentially all the metabolic waste, anything that's not needed anymore by the body. So what's going to happen in the kidneys? Well, first you're going to have this filtration process that I keep talking about. This filtration occurs in the glomerulus. That's the first step that's going to happen. So you've collected all this fluid, this filtrate, but then the kidney's going to have to go through a process and figure out, well, some of this may really need to go back into the blood, depending on what is occurring right now, what the needs are right now at this moment. And so a lot of what filtered out is going to be put back into the blood. So you took it out, now you got to put it back in. That is reabsorption, is when you are moving substances from this filtrate and putting it back into the blood. And then there's going to be secretion. Secretion is when any remaining substances in the blood, you might become, you know what, no, depending on the circumstances right now that we're detecting of what's going on in the body, we need to move some more of this out of the blood. And so secretion is moving substances out of the blood. So both filtration and secretion are moving substances out of the blood into the urine. Reabsorption is moving substances from that filtrate, which is going to become the urine, back into the blood. And this diagram is showing this, hopefully in a more clear, summarized version. The red number 1 marker is showing in that glomerulus that you have those glomerular capillaries, the blood's flowing in, and most of the substances will be flowing out by filtration. Where does it flow? Down the tibia. And then number 2, the blue. This is reabsorption. So like I said, you're putting substances back into the blood. How? You're putting it back through the peritibial capillaries now. And then secretion, which is the green arrow, is where substances are flowing out of the blood into the tubule, once again forming the urine, which will be eventually expelled from the body. This glomerular filtration is a passive process, so that means it does not require any input of energy. How is it occurring as a passive process? Because of the pressure. You have, remember, high blood pressure as it's coming into the glomerulus, and that's going to help force substances out and not allow it to be reabsorbed in the glomerulus. There are 3 different layers that are involved here. First, the substances are going to pass through the capillaries. Remember, they're fenestrate. They have those pores to allow more increased movement out of the blood. The pressure, because it's higher in the blood capillaries, is going to be pushing it out, not allowing things to pass back into the blood. Then it's going to have to pass through the basement membrane and then through the podiocytes. So you can see on this picture the afferent arteriole bringing the blood in to the glomerular capillaries, where the filtrate, because of the high blood pressure, it's being forced out. Where does all this filtrate go to? Remember that glomerular capsule is like a hollow cup. It's all flowing in there, and it's going to force it down into entering the proximal convoluted tubule. And this just shows the fenestrations of the pores that allow for the movement of substances out of the blood into this capsule. Those pores, keep in mind, however, are small enough that proteins and cells cannot pass through. And this is just another visual, actually a histology slide. So as you can see, things are moving because of the pressure from the capillary. They're moving out and into that capsule space. Now, water, glucose, amino acids, nitrogenous waste products are allowed to pass through. Proteins cannot pass, they're too large. If you were to find proteins in urine, that means it entered in the filtrate, which would indicate that there is some type of a membrane problem in the glomerular capsule area. So like I said, that pressure is higher. It is forcing everything out. If you want to get into specifics of it, we have been able to measure it. We know it's about 55 milligrams of mercury. And so there's pressure also forcing back in. The net pressure is about 10. And so this is showing what your net pressure is going to be. Once again, it's higher in the blood, so it's forcing things out. The glomerular filtration rate is relatively steady. This is the amount that you have of the filtrate being formed, being pushed out. You want it to be relatively constant so that the kidneys are producing this filtrate, which becomes the urine, at a regular rate. It is going to be controlled by various intrinsic and extrinsic control mechanisms. One thing certainly is going to play a huge role in this will be your systemic blood pressure. If you have increased rate, which means you're going to be increasing urine output, that is going to lower the blood pressure because you have more filtration going on. That's going to decrease the blood pressure. If you have decreased urine output, then that means you're going to be increasing the blood pressure. Some of this makes sense if anyone's familiar with a lot of your blood pressure medications. They're actually diuretics, which what they do is they will increase the urine output. That's what a diuretic does. It increases the glomerular filtration rate, which increases urine output, which then brings that blood pressure down. The nervous system can also play a role. The endocrine system can also play a role. I said the intrinsic ones are within. Think of it as auto-regulation. Excuse me. There are a couple of ways of regulating this internally. Smooth muscle can, with the afferent arterioles, as that blood is coming into the glomulars, into that capillary bed, there are smooth muscles there that can contract, that can then decrease the amount of blood flow into the glomulars. That would protect the glomulars from very high blood pressure. You don't want the blood pressure to be too high. You need it to be higher so that filtration occurs, but you don't want the blood pressure to be too high because that can end up damaging, and then you ultimately would end up with kidney damage. So it helps to regulate the blood pressure there by regulating the amount of blood flow into the glomulars. It can also internally respond to the concentration of sodium chloride, NaCl, that's in the filtrate. And so if the sodium chloride concentration, depending on whether it gets too high or too low, if it becomes very high in the filtrate, what's happening is you have decreased reabsorption time. You need to slow that down so that you can reabsorb some of it back in. The extrinsic controls, like I said, are neural and hormonal. We want to control the blood pressure extrinsically, the sympathetic nervous system. Under normal conditions, the renal blood vessels are going to be dilating, and it just allows the internal autoregulation to occur. If the sympathetic nervous system is stimulated, then it will constrict those renal blood vessels, having less blood flow through the kidneys. Now, this can also play with low blood pressure. It will also constrict and decrease the amount of blood pressure. If you decrease the amount of, or decrease the blood flow, that's going to increase the pressure. And then in terms, excuse me, of hormonal, there's different mechanisms for increasing blood pressure, and this has to do with the renin, angiotensin, and aldosterone mechanisms, stimulating these hormones to help increase blood pressure. So this is a summary of all the different ways. Once again, just keep in mind that the blood pressure needs to be higher in that glomulus capillary bed so that filtration will occur. And there's multiple ways of controlling it. If an individual has abnormally low urinary output, less than 50 mils per day, it's anuria, and that might be an indication that the blood pressure in that glomulus is too low for filtration to occur. It can also be indicating that the nephrons are no longer functioning properly. This leads to renal failure. What could be causing this? Well, you could have an infection of the nephrons. You could be having injuries associated with the kidney itself.